Hello and welcome back to another episode of Let's Celebrate, a Holiday Origins podcast. I'm your host, Rusty Brown, and today we're celebrating death holidays. Ooh, spooky. This is the podcast where each episode I research a specific holiday and discuss the history behind it, how the people before us celebrated it, how it evolved into what we celebrate today, and then I look at how we can incorporate some of the traditional ways of celebrating back into the holidays so we can reconnect to why we're celebrating the holidays in the first place. Each episode includes a CeLibation that is a themed cocktail that goes along with the holiday so you can make it home to celebrate along with me as you listen. The CeLibation for this episode is a spiked pumpkin pie spiced apple cider. It's quite a mouthful. So for this CeLibation, you need fresh apples, oranges, sweetener of choice, pumpkin pie spice, water, and rum or whiskey if you decide to make this into a spiked cider. I used 4 apples and 2 oranges, and it really just depends on how much you're making or like how big your pot is. Then you're going to just slice the apples and oranges and put them in a pot and add the pumpkin pie spice. I used a tablespoon for 4 apples and 2 oranges. And then you're just going to cover that with water, leaving like a little bit of area at the top of your pot so it doesn't bubble over. And you're going to heat it over a high heat until it reaches a simmer. Then you're going to reduce the heat to a medium-low or low, depending on your stove. My low is like probably most people's medium-low. And then you're going to let that simmer for about an hour. At that point, I took the oranges out and I just squished the liquid out of them because I had left the orange peel on them, and the orange peel gives it like a bitter flavor, which I like, but too much is too much. So I just squished out the juice of the orange and took that out of it, and then I also squished the apples up against the pot to kind of like smash them and get some juice out of those. And then I added my sweetener, and I used honey, and I have no idea how much I used, so you use however much you want. You could also use maple syrup or brown sugar to add a more autumnal depth of flavor. And then you're going to add some more water to kind of bring it back to what you originally had, because you probably will have lost some of your juice. And then you're going to simmer for another hour. Then, using a strainer or a cheesecloth, you're going to strain out all the solid pieces into a container to get the juices out. And you can discard the solids, or you can keep them and use them in smoothies or cakes or cookies. I think I'm going to either make an apple cake or some kind of cookies. I think that would be a great idea. So I saved mine, put it in the fridge, and we'll deal with that tomorrow. And then, your cider is ready to go. You'll want to serve it warm. To spike it, you're going to add an ounce or so of your favorite whiskey or rum. You're going to want something dark and or spice. Like I said before, if you want a mocktail, then just don't add any alcohol into it and just pour yourself a glass of warm apple cider and enjoy. But try not to drink it all by yourself. I almost did. I did share some with friends though. So last month's episode was about Central America's Independence Day, or Dia de Independencia. And if you listened to that episode and possibly incorporated some new to you traditions, I would love to hear about them. Or did you perhaps learn more about Central America's history? Or did you find some kind of cultural event to attend? I would love to hear about it, and I could also share those stories on the podcast if anybody decides to share them with me. You can email me at letscelebratepodcast@gmail.com with your celebratory stories. I also have an Instagram page, and that is Let's Celebrate Podcast. And if you prefer to watch the episodes, I have a YouTube channel that I upload the videos of the episodes to as well. So you can like and subscribe on YouTube. And my channel on there is youtube.com/@letscelebratepodcast. So I basically celebrated the Central America's Independence Day the entire week. There was activities all week at the school, in our neighborhood. We went to the beach. So there was a coronation at the local school for the Independencia Queen and her royal court. And that was like where they got crowned. And then that was also combined with an award ceremony for academic achievements of the kids as well. And then on another day, there was a parade on our street that pretty much the entire neighborhood participated in. So there weren't actually many people like watching the parade. And it was more of what I would call a procession. There was a band at the beginning, and the royal court and the Independencia Queen. And behind them were a lot of people walking or on motorcycles. We paraded down the main street and ended up at the school, where once we got to the auditorium area, the band put on a performance with dancers. I also went to 2 different pageant or dances. I don't know exactly. They just called them bailes, which translates to dances, but they also call, like, when you go out dancing with your friends, bailes. So I don't know what we would translate that to in English, but it was kind of like a pageant where the kids had costumes and they did dances. A lot of the dances were like indigenous dances, and they told the story of Guatemala's indigenous history. There were several dances that were ancestral dances that incorporated planting or working the land, and one that was the Mayan goddess of water. And there were also several antorchas. I thought that I had never heard of them, but then I realized that I had talked about these in the last episode where I talked about them passing a torch in the street, but I didn't realize like what that meant or what that was until I actually participated in it. So we started at the beach, which is about 30 minutes from my house, and 2 to 3 trucks with kids in the back, and me in my car with some of my friends, and some other people on motorcycles from our neighborhood drove very slowly back to our neighborhood. In certain areas, some of the kids would get out of the trucks, and then they would light a torch, and then they would run in the street in front of our vehicles. So this is the antorcha, which is like a torch, antorcha. There were other groups from other neighborhoods doing the same thing, and then there were also people on the side of the road, or some of the people on the motorcycles were like throwing water, or had like buckets of water, or they had like bags of water that they were throwing. Sometimes they would open them and throw them at people, and sometimes they just threw the bags and hit people. It's not good. I don't understand the throwing of the bags of water. It was kind of like mayhem, but also fun. I think I would have had a lot more fun if I was a kid. It was interesting to see it as an adult, but I could tell the kids really enjoyed it. I'm glad I didn't have to run in the streets, and I was glad that I was able to roll my windows down to like listen to the music and like have fun that way, but then also be able to roll my windows up when there were people throwing water things at us. The torch symbolizes freedom and the passing of freedom from generation to generation. So, with this month's episode, let's celebrate death holidays, starting with America's second biggest holiday, Halloween, and its lesser known cousin, Samhain, which is possibly the actual origin of all the death holidays, and then the Latin American death holiday, Die de Los Muertos. This is going to be a pretty long episode. There was so much info to cover for 3 different holidays. I know I'm sure to leave some things out, but you just have to get to a point where you say enough is enough. I need to stop writing and get to recording. So hopefully this is informative and entertaining to you, and please don't get mad if I leave something out or if I forget to mention something. But you can also just email me if you think that I do need to know, and let me know if I've left something out. Also, there are some Aztec words that are pretty difficult to pronounce, so please forgive my pronunciation when I get to those words. I will do my best. I'm going to start with the history of Halloween and Samhain, and then we'll talk about the history of Dia de los Muertos. So Halloween is celebrated on October 31st, and this year it will occur on Tuesday, October 31st. And Halloween is traditionally believed to be the night when the veil between life and death is most transparent, and it's believed that the dead can pass through to walk in our world. It also marks the end of summer and ushers in the colder months, and that reminds people how close we are to death, especially in areas where the days stay dark longer and the temperatures are dangerously cold. So October and November is like a transition time between the warm and the cold, when you can really start to feel the seasons changing with the arrival of the cold weather. This is the time of year when people believe that more spiritual or strange things can happen. A lot of Halloween traditions actually originated with a Celtic festival called Samhain, and it's actually spelt, it looks like it should be pronounced Samhain, but since it's Gaelic, it's pronounced Samhain, is what I have heard from other sources. And Samhain was traditionally celebrated on October 31st and November 1st, and has 2,000 to 3,000 years of history, starting with the Celts in the British Islands, North France, and the Irish Sea. Samhain is the Gaelic name for November and is the celebration of ushering in the month of November and its colder weather and spookiness. Samhain is actually the first of the 4 quarterly fire festivals, which I've discussed in previous episodes, and it falls at the midpoint between the fall equinox and the winter solstice. Since it's considered the first of these fire festivals, it's become a modern idea that Samhain is the new year for the ancient Celtic or Gaelic people. But there isn't actually a whole lot of ancient evidence for this idea. It is also 6 months from Beltane, which is my birthday, and one of the other 5 fire festivals that happens on April 30th and May 1st. Beltane is a festival celebrating life and the living, and Samhain celebrates death and the dead. In the 10th century, a tale called The Wooing of Emer, written by Christian monks, said that Samhain was to be a time when peace would be declared. There would be great gatherings with feasting and alcohol and contests, and new laws and duties were to be ordained. And then the Roman Empire in 43 AD conquered most of the Celtic territory. And in the 400 years that Rome ruled the Celts, they combined a couple Roman festivals with Samhain. These festivals were called Feralia, which was a festival in late October that was for commemorating the passing of the dead. And Pomona is a festival that honors the Roman goddess Pomona, who was the goddess of fruits and trees. Her symbol was an apple, and many people believe that the tradition of bobbing for apples comes from this festival. In the 4th century, with the rise of Christianity, accommodations for pagan beliefs were made. They basically just took Samhain traditions and made them more Christian. And then in the 5th century, Pope Boniface moved the celebration to May 13th, and this was a day for celebrating saints and martyrs. This was also the date of Lumeria, which was an ancient Roman festival of the dead. The pagans did continue to celebrate the fire festival at the beginning of November despite this change. In the 9th century, Pope Gregory changed the Saint and Martyrs Day back to the time of the fire festival, but declared that November 1st would be All Saints' Day or All Hallows' Day. And this is when Samhain began its transformation to Halloween, which was celebrated on October 31st. Which is All Hallows Eve, the night before All Hallows Day. Ween is Old English for Eve, which is where we get Halloween from. November 2nd was celebrated as All Souls Day, and these 3 days collectively were called All Hallowtide. In the 16th century, after Martin Luther's Protestant movement, Protestants used Halloween to exploit Catholicism, and the Protestants refused to celebrate any of the All-Hallowtide holidays. Since the Protestants strongly opposed Halloween and its customs and traditions, when the Protestants came to the U.S., they didn't want to bring Catholic ideas and traditions with them. They did, however, bring a belief that there is a spirit world that can be easily accessed during this time of year. In the mid-19th century, it was common to have autumn festivals, but it wasn't yet common to have Halloween festivals. At the end of the 19th century, the Irish came to the U.S. during the Great Potato Famine, and they brought their Halloween and Samhain traditions with them. Now for some Dia de los Muertos history. Dia de los Muertos translates to the Day of the Dead and is mostly a Mexican holiday. It blends together Mesoamerican ritual with European religion and Spanish culture. It's celebrated on October 31st through November 2nd. Aztec tradition says that the gates of heaven open at midnight on October 31st to allow the spirits of children to spend time with their families for 24 hours, and then on November 2nd, the spirits of adults are able to pass through to spend times with their family as well. The spirits are welcomed back by their families with food, drink, and celebration. These celebrations of the dead are said to go back nearly 3,000 years to pre-Columbian Mesoamerican and the Aztecs and the Nahua people who lived in what we now know as Central Mexico. These people saw the universe as cyclical and therefore viewed death as an ever-present and integral part of life. Because of these beliefs, this holiday is seen more as a celebration of life of the dead as a positive thing rather than being sad and mournful over the loss of a loved one. This festival is said to have come from the Aztec festival for the goddess, and here we go, Micteacacihuatl, the Lady of the Dead, who is said to watch over the bones of the dead and swallows the stars during the day. According to the beliefs of the Nahua, after a person died, they would travel to the land of the dead, or Chikunamictlan, and they would have to go through 9 challenging levels to reach the final resting place of Mictlan. This journey was thought to take several years, so the living family members would provide food, water, and tools to aid them on their journey. Traditionally, the rituals took place in August. The Aztec people actually had 6 celebrations during the year that celebrated death, and another one that was celebrated between October 20th and November 8th was called Quecholi, which was a celebration in honor of the god of war, Mixcoatl. People would place altars of food, and that food was usually tamales, near the burial grounds of warriors that was said to aid them on their journey to the afterlife. As I mentioned in the Halloween history, the Roman Catholic Church celebrated All Saints or Hallows Day and All Souls Day on November 1st and 2nd. In medieval Spain, they also celebrated All Souls Day and All Saints Day, and they did this by covering their loved ones' graves with flowers and candles. And when the Spanish conquered Mexico, they brought with them these traditions. The candles were thought to illuminate a way back to their earthly home. They would also leave wine and pan de anime, which also called spirit bread, for their loved ones. Since the Spanish did such a great job at pretty much wiping out the indigenous population and eradicating their culture and replacing it with Catholicism, sadly, it's difficult to know where Aztec traditions end and Spanish and European influences begin. There is now a belief that Lázaro Cárdenas, the Mexican president from 1934 to 1940, used Dia de los Muertos as a way to use Aztec identity to encourage Mexican nationalism by rebranding Spanish traditions as an Aztec tradition. And some academics argue that the festival might not have genuine indigenous pre-Hispanic roots, as has become the popular belief. Now we're going to take a look at how these death holidays were celebrated in the past, starting with Samhain and Halloween. So Samhain was mainly celebrated as a harvest festival. It's actually the last of the harvest festivals that the Gaelic and Celtic celebrated. And Lunasa, which I discussed in my August episode, was the first. Then there's the autumnal equinox on September 21st as the second, and Samhain was the last and biggest of them all. It's the end of the harvest season and the time when people would have been starting to prepare and hunker down for the scary winter. One of the main ways that the community would commemorate this festival was, of course, with a fire. While the families were out gathering the harvest, they left the hearth fires in their home to burn out, and once they were done with their harvest work, they would join Druid priests at a community gathering. At these gatherings, they would light a wheel that represented the sun that caused friction and sparked flames. During this ritual, there were prayers and cattle sacrifices, and at the end, each participant would take a flame from the community bonfire and relight their home hearth with it. There are a few different ideas about what the symbolism of the bonfire is. It could be a form of imitative or sympathetic magic, with the fire mimicking the power of the sun to hold back the decay and the darkness of winter that's to come, with the power of growth. It could also be symbolic of burning up and destroying the harmful influences. And in the 18th and 19th century, it became a popular belief that fire, smoke, and ash had protective and cleansing powers. Halloween, or the first night of Samhain, was said to be the best time to predict the future because of the veil being thinner. The nights of Samhain were said to be the best time to predict the future because of the veil being thinner between the worlds. Some people did divining practices with the sacrificed animals, doing things like reading the entrails of animals to see the future or tell someone's fortune. With the belief that the veil was thinner during this time of year, there also are many tales of fairies, impish creatures, and ancestors being present. The Celts disguised themselves as they went outside of their villages, dressed as animals or monsters, to keep the otherworld creatures from kidnapping them. They believed by wearing animal skins or masks that the spirits would mistake them for other spirits and would in turn leave them alone. They would also appease the spirits with treats left outside of the village to coax them away from their homes and the farms during this festival. This was also believed to keep them safe as well as the crops. There is also documentation that in some areas people celebrated with 6 days of drinking to excess, most likely beer and mead, and feasting gluttonously. Many people would need to kill the animals that they couldn't keep or afford to keep over the winter. So this time of year would have been bountiful with the fresh harvest and the access to more animals to eat than at other times of the year. In the Middle Ages, the celebrations progressed to more personal bonfires that were held closer to the farms and were said to protect the families from fairies and witches. This is also when people started carving faces into turnips called jack-o'-lanterns that they would attach to sticks with strings and fill with coal to light. The jack-o'-lantern is based on the legend of Stingy Jack, who was said to repeatedly trap the devil and only let him go when the devil agreed that Jack would never be sent to hell. But after Jack died, heaven didn't want his soul either, so his soul was forced to wander the earth for eternity. The devil gifted Jack a carved out turnip lit by a lump of burning coal to light his wandering way. People eventually added the carving of faces as a way to scare away the evil spirits. When the tradition came to the U.S. with the Irish, they eventually switched to pumpkins because they were more readily available in the U.S. The tradition of a dumpstupper started around this time as well. This is a dinner where people would invite their dead ancestors to their homes for a night of dinner and entertainment. They would have a place set for the dead relatives, and after dinner, the children would play games for the dead, and the adults would update them on the past year's news. In Ireland and possibly Scotland, there was an ancient practice called mumming. People would put on costumes, go door to door, and sing songs to the dead. In return, they would usually get some kind of cake. This is said to be where trick-or-treating may have originated. All Hallows Day on November 1st for early Christians was considered one of the major feast days, along with Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost. They would celebrate with a vigil starting the evening before, or All Hallows Eve, or Halloween as we now call it. This was a time when Western Christians honored all the saints and prayed for recently departed souls who had yet to reach heaven. And on All Hallows Day, they celebrated with a feast. At the end of the 12th century, All Hallows Day and Halloween had become holy days of obligation in Western Christianity, meaning that the faithful were expected to attend Mass and rest from work and any other activities that might take away worship that's owed to God. Historically, some Christians also abstained from meat on All Hallows Eve, and it was tradition to eat apples, potato pancakes, and soul cakes on this vigil day. At this time, it was tradition to also ring church bells for the souls in purgatory, and people would dress in black, and these people were called criers, and they would walk through the streets ringing a mournful sounding bell and call to all Christians to remember the poor souls. In the 15th century, in parts of England, Wales, Flanders, Bavaria, and Austria, there was a custom of baking and sharing soul cakes for all christened souls for All Hallowtide. This was a tradition called souling, where groups of poor people, usually children, went door to door collecting the soul cakes. And they would pray for the dead friends and relatives of the givers in exchange for the soul cakes. This custom is said to be another origin of trick-or-treating, or it's also very similar to mumming. In medieval France, they believed that the dead rose on Halloween for a wild and hideous carnival in the churchyards. This phenomenon was called Danse Macabre and was depicted in church decorations and was a reminder to Christians that all earthly things have an end. Many European villages had pageants and people dressed up as corpses from different classes of society, and this is thought to be one of the origins of Halloween costume parties. During the 17th through the 20th century, in Ireland and Britain, they began playing deviation games that had originated in the Middle Ages. One of the most popular of these games is bobbing for apples, apple bobbing or apple dunking or duking in Scotland. People place several apples into a tub or basin of water, and participants have to retrieve an apple using only their teeth. Most of these divination games involved apples and hazelnuts because in Celtic mythology, apples were associated with the otherworld and immortality, and hazelnuts were associated with divine wisdom. It is also suggested that these ideas could have derived from the Roman festival Pomona, because they also had similar beliefs around apples and hazelnuts. These games were originally seen as deadly serious and were more of a ritual than a game that only a few people played when they first originated. But they have now become part of many households' festivities during Halloween. A lot of the other games were for fortune telling, like foretelling of future partner. In the 1800s, once Halloween had made its way to the States, in Maryland and the southern colonies, they celebrated Halloween with play parties. And play parties were public events to celebrate the harvest. Everyone would gather publicly to share stories of the dead, tell each other's fortunes, and dance and sing. It also became popular for kids to vandalize farms, streets, and people on Halloween night. Then once Halloween started becoming a more popular holiday in the 1900s, there was a move to make it more of a gathering of community and neighbors rather than about ghosts and pranks and witchcraft, turning it into more of a secular, community-centered holiday. The party started to be more focused on games, festive costumes, and seasonal foods. And parents were encouraged to take the frightening and grotesque out of Halloween celebrations by the newspapers and community leaders. At this time, Halloween lost a lot of its superstitious and religious overtones. In the 1930s is when trick-or-treating as we now know it began, with people handing out apples and nuts to children, mostly going door to door in their costumes. This was also seen as a way to bribe kids from not vandalizing or doing any tricks to the house by handing out candy and treats. That's why trick or treat. So yeah, the kids would knock on the door and ask trick or treat, implying that if they don't get a treat, they will do some form of mischief to the house or to the family. Then by the 1950s, Halloween was a holiday mainly directed towards children, and with that, the festivities moved from the larger communities to schools and homes to tailor and accommodate the holiday to the children. In the 1970s, there was a Devil's Night in Detroit with houses burning and the country was frightened. And then in 1980s, there was a scare with poisoned candy and razor blades. Now we're going to switch back to Die de Los Muertos and how it was celebrated in the past. So traditionally, the Aztecs would leave out food and water and other supplies to aid their deceased loved ones to the final resting place. In the 16th century, the Spanish conquistadors for All Souls' Day brought with them the traditions of decorating the graves and lighting a path back to earth for their loved ones. These two traditions combined to create probably the most common way people celebrated the Day of the Dead, making altars called ofrendas for the dead. And these are usually decorated tables in the home where families leave food and other offerings to their loved ones who have passed on. Some families also do this in the cemetery at the graves of their loved ones. Marigolds are used to cover the Dia de los Muertos ofrendas or to decorate graves, because it's thought that they attract or guide souls of the dead to the offerings or from the cemeteries back to their family homes with their bright colors and their strong smell. Marigolds are also called cempasúchil, or in modern Mexico, flor de muerto, which is flower of the dead. Some people believe that the dead were able to bring prosperity, like an abundant harvest, or misfortune like financial problems, illnesses, or accidents. And that what they decided to bestow on their relatives depended on how satisfactorily the dead thought that the relatives executed their ofrendas. So there's also always great care taken in the preparations of an ofrenda in hopes that the ancestors will bestow a good fortune to their families. As I mentioned before, the Spanish ate pan de ánimas, or spirit bread, traditionally during All Hallowtide, and in Mexico it has become a tradition to eat pan de muerto, which is a sweet egg bread that's made in different shapes, sometimes as skulls or decorated with a white icing that's made to look like twisted bones. A very common symbol of Dia de los Muertos are skeletons called calacas and skulls or calaveras. This became popular in the early 20th century with an artwork from 1910 called La Calavera Catrina, or Elegant Skull, by Jose Guadalupe Posada. This artwork features a female skeleton with makeup and fancy clothes. The central motif of Posada's art was that he represented all of humanity as skulls instead of faces, regardless of class, status, or occupation. This particular artwork was originally intended to be a statement about Mexicans adopting what was considered fashionable for Europeans instead of their own traditions and heritage. Some people suggest that La Calavera Catrina was meant to be a modern representation of the Aztec queen of the underworld, Mictecacihuatl, while others think that Posada was influenced by the Danse Macabre of medieval France. Nevertheless, she has now become a prominent figure for Dia de los Muertos and Mexico in general. Candy or chocolate skulls are also placed on the ofrendas as gifts to the dead. The skulls as a symbol could have come from the Aztecs' use of skulls in rituals and trophies from battles. Papel picado is a Mexican folk art made of tissue paper with elaborate designs cut out, and this comes from an Aztec tradition of chiseling spirit figures on a handmade paper called amate that was made using the bark of mulberry and fig trees. For Dia de los Muertos, people began creating several papeles picados and strung them together to put on their ofrendas and decorated the streets with them. Traditional foods that have been eaten for Dia de los Muertos are mole, tamales, pozole, and sopa azteca, made with recipes that have been passed down for generations within each family. In the 1980s, Dia de los Muertos began spreading to larger cities. Up until then, it had largely only been celebrated in rural indigenous areas in Mexico. And then in 2008, UNESCO added the Day of the Dead to its Intangible Cultural Heritage of Humanities list. So, how do people celebrate these holidays today? There has been a resurgence in some areas where they have started celebrating Samhain, and from what I can tell, they try to make it more like the old festivals. In America, they celebrate mainly Halloween, and they spend nearly $6 billion every year on Halloween, making it the country's second largest commercial holiday after Christmas. Popular ways of celebrating Halloween are costume parties, carving pumpkins into jack-o'-lanterns, bonfires, apple bobbing, visiting haunted attractions, and watching Halloween-themed movies. Many people go to Halloween parties, and the parties might include lighting bonfires, bobbing for apples, divination games, telling scary stories, and watching horror movies. Some people still like to play pranks by TPing or egging a house. Those are things that really bad kids like to do on Halloween night. And going to a haunted attraction or theme parks have become a modern tradition that people enjoy doing. Many children still go trick-or-treating dressed up as monsters or their favorite pop culture character, and they go door to door through their neighborhoods asking for candy. There are also now a lot of trick-or-treating events that are aimed at keeping kids safer and more contained, keeping them off of the streets. And these are at locals, zoos, malls, local businesses, and even churches, though most churches refer to these as trunk or treats. And they decorate the trunk of a car and have the candy in the back of the trunk. And some communities and neighborhoods have embraced a national trick-or-treat day that's celebrated on the last Saturday of October, so that kids and families can go out and trick-or-treat on a Saturday without worrying about staying out late on a school night if Halloween happens to land on a school night. I know that when I was a kid, I was always super bummed when Halloween ended up on a school night. It was so much more fun when it was on a Friday or a Saturday. So I would have appreciated a national trick-or-treat day. Some Catholics still practice the observation of All Hallows Eve by attending church services and lighting candles at the graves of the dead. And also there's more youth traffic accidents on Halloween due to masks. So be careful driving with a mask. Probably not a good idea. And now we're going to talk about Dia de los Muertos and how they celebrate today. Nowadays, the ofrendas are decorated with candles, marigolds, food like tortillas, and fruit, and the deceased favorite foods and alcohol, and sometimes a red coxcomb. I should have looked more into that. I don't know why they do that. In some parts of Mexico, it's customary to leave out pillows and blankets for the deceased to rest after their long journey. So this probably comes from the Aztec tradition of aiding the deceased onto their final resting place. And there's also some people who actually spend the night at the graves of their relatives, or they have picnics at the grave sites. People also now wear skull masks or paint their face like a sugar skull or calavera. Candy or chocolate skulls are placed on the ofrendas or given as gifts for living people, and they sometimes have the name of the recipient on the forehead. It's also become popular for kids to dress up and go door to door in larger cities in Mexico. This is similar to trick-or-treating, but they don't threaten to do a trick if they don't get a treat. They either knock on the door, or they might also ask people that they just pass in the street for a calaverita, which is a small gift of either money or candy. It's also now customary to drink a spicy dark chocolate or atole, which is a corn-based drink, on Dia de los Muertos, or around this time of year. This day isn't completely focused on the dead now. It's also become common to give gifts to living family and friends. Some common gifts to give are sugar skulls, pan de muerto, and some people write calaveras literarias, or a light-hearted mock epitaph written in verse dedicated to their living friends or acquaintances. I found a Hallmark article that explained how to write a calaveras literarias. And so the first thing you do is pick your subject, someone or something to eulogize, and you'll introduce your subject, and then you'll decide how they meet la muerta, or how they die. And then in the article, the Hallmark staff entered some poems, and one example was a calaveras literarias for cervezas, and it goes, down at the cantina they're shedding big tears in mourning because someone killed a few beers. So just lighthearted. It can be about anything, anybody, and yeah, it's just a fun, creative way to express yourself and look at death in a more positive way. In many larger cities across Mexico, Central and South America, as well as the U.S., there are large festivals with dancers, people in costumes, streets decorated with papel pegados and skulls, and sometimes mariachi bands, and community ofrendas, and other local traditions. And to wish someone a happy Day of the Dead, you would say, Feliz Dia de los Muertos. So how can we incorporate some of these traditional ways of celebrating back into the holidays today? For all of the holidays, the central theme, I think, is that death is part of life, and it's better to embrace it than to be scared of it. See it as more of a natural part of the human experience that it is, and see it in a more positive light. Also, it's important to remember and celebrate our ancestors who have passed into the other world. I think it's also probably a good idea to try to think about this time as being a time when we can access our ancestors more freely. Since many cultures had this belief that this time of year was a time where the veil was thinner, maybe we should contemplate why that is. Some ways that we can incorporate traditional ways might be connecting to your ancestors with a dumb supper, or creating an ofrenda or altar for them, or visit their graves and decorate them, or leave offerings for them at the graves. Of course, you can always build a bonfire. Try not to sacrifice an animal unless you're into that. Gather with your family or community. See what kind of events are going on in your area. Be open to going to an event that you may have not done before, such as the Dia de Los Muertos event. I know in Little Rock, the downtown community, along with the library, there's a Halloween and a Dia de los Muertos fiesta. I think probably most larger cities these days probably have several different events you could go to. You could try your hand at writing a calaveras literaria to a friend, or just to an object, whatever. I've added the article to the references that shows examples of how to write one if you're interested. These also don't have to be to a person. Like I said, it can be the death of an object or an idea, or even just a concept. This is a fun and a bit macabre way of letting your creativity flow. Just keep it lighthearted and silly. You can also watch a scary movie. I've become so accustomed to watching scary movies around Halloween that now when I start to feel the first chill of the autumn air, I get in the mood for a horror movie. I really don't like scary movies that much, but there's something about when the weather's cooler, it just feels right. I also enjoy watching like old episodes, Halloween episodes, or things like that. I like to watch old Halloween movies because I have this like idea of like a 90s Halloween, because that's when I grew up. So like watching Goosebumps or something like that kind of gets me in the mood, makes me feel Halloweeny. If you have a haunted house or a theme park near you, you could try going to one of those. And then maybe contemplate the inevitability of death and work on shifting your perspective from scared to acceptance. Because we are all going to die, and isn't it better to celebrate all the parts of this human experience instead of dreading it and being frightened by it? I know I would rather be celebrated and positively remembered instead of mourned and have people feeling sad about me not being here once I die. I think overall, this time of year is about trusting others, being more connected to one another, and knowing that we are all going to die. But not letting fear guide us in life or into death, but pushing past the fear and embracing it as part of life. And really, all these holidays are kind of giving us permission to let go and give into the dark, ritualistic side of life for just one night. So that wraps it up for this episode. I'll be back in November to discuss the good and the bad of Thanksgiving. If you've enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, please like and subscribe. Maybe even leave a review if you liked it. Do you celebrate Halloween or Dia de los Muertos? Or Samhain? Or maybe both? or maybe another death holiday that I've never even heard of. I would love to hear your celebratory stories, and feel free to send me an email with those stories at letscelebratepodcast@gmail.com. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Let's Celebrate Podcast and YouTube at youtube.com/Let's Celebrate Podcast. All of my references are in the show notes. If you're interested in reading more about Halloween and Dia de los Muertos and their celebrations and traditions. Thanks for listening and joining me on this adventure. Have fun celebrating, and I hope you've learned something new today. Adios!